I noticed that the press or the media were basically using race, which is a socially constructed idea, socially constructed concept, with no scientific basis, to actually use race to explain what's happening to people in terms of the impact of COVID. So they were using race to explain COVID. That was bad, but then it got even more worrying when they were using, if you like, how someone is infected by the virus as a way of redefining what race is. And they were using it effectively to give race, if you like, a scientific credibility. So suddenly, this thing that was, if you like, had no scientific basis, they're now basically saying, right, basically, if you're infected with COVID, chances are it's because you come from a certain ethnic background or a certain racial background. So they were using science to, if you like, to explain COVID, and also using COVID to give race scientific credibility, which I felt was wrong. And what it was doing, it was sort of suffocating, if you like. It was confusing to people. Lots of people were confused by it, but it was also suffocating the debate about structural racism and all those things. So whenever, for example, you had someone with a social kind of background coming in and saying, right, these things are structural racism or structural problems within our society. It's about housing, it's about education, it's about the diet you can, employment, it's about the diet. People say, oh no, there's scientific basis, there's a genetic link between diabetes or whatever it was, and that kind of thing. And so those people couldn't really counter. So what I've done is I basically said, yes, diabetes does have a genetic element, but a lot of diabetes, particularly the type that affects our community, is more about environmental factors. And yes, there are underlying genetic things, but it's primarily about the environmental factors. And those environmental factors are made worse by structural racism. So it's putting those arguments out there and sort of countering the idea that it's linked to something that's inheriting your genes is what I wanted to counter. And the other thing that reason why I wanted to do this, if you can get people or society to accept that people are different in terms of susceptible to something like a virus, it can then lead to things later down the line where you can, for example, have, for example, an employer saying, I'm not taking on that individual because they're more likely in the winter to, be off because they're sick, suffering from virus. All kinds of things can go on from that. If you remember, about 2 or 3 weeks ago, there was one manager in the NHS suggesting that they're going to not put BME staff into certain places. And again, that's a very dangerous thing to be suggesting when you think about the extension. It's going to be basically saying, yes, we can employ BME staff, but they can't do certain jobs.
From your research and your understanding of what's happening, why do you think that these groups are being disproportionately affected?
Right. So, I mean, the same data, because I had a good look at the ONS statistics and data, but not just for COVID deaths, but if you could look at the ONS data for a variety of social outcomes. It could be criminal justice, it could be where you live, it could be employment, it could be so many things. I'm a university lecturer. One of the things we're obsessed with at the moment is something called the university awarding gap, something called the attainment gap. And even that, the pattern looks exactly the same. So it's not just COVID. All of these, if you like, outcomes, you have the same pattern, if you like, this kind of racialized hierarchy where the most affected people tend to be Black, and then it goes down all the way. And so it's not unique to COVID. So the interesting thing about COVID is, for the first time, people were sort of saying there is something genetic. Previously, the other things, they were about socio-economic things, if you like, but now people are actually linking that to, that's why I think it's so dangerous, because you're moving away from saying that, these are not social things, it's actually something inherent in the person. And then once you make that link, then you can say all those other things that we are disproportionately affected by can also be linked to your genes.
One of those arguments, I guess, that has come up is this vitamin D deficiency. And it's one of the things that have been, I guess, bolstered the argument that there is a disproportionate impact on BAME groups because of their genetic makeup.
Yes.
Can you just talk a little bit about that? I know you explored it in the article that we published on the Voice website.
Clearly, as I said, if you have high levels of melanin in your skin and you're darker and you don't get enough sunlight, you will have lower levels of not guaranteed, but chances are you will do. Okay, so there's no doubt about it. There's lots of data to suggest that. But then there's lots of debate about the role of vitamin D in the immune system, for one thing. Some studies have shown, for example, that if you have low levels of vitamin D, it actually activates your immune system to cause things like certain autoimmune diseases. There's another study that shows if you supplement, and these are individuals who, the study doesn't actually make it clear, if you supplement with only certain levels of vitamin D, you will actually get protection from, if you like, certain respiratory infections. And it's that some people have latched onto, but it only occurs for certain conditions. And what I'm saying, it's a quite complicated story. So it's not as simple as vitamin D levels. Vitamin D is very important, and there are lots of particularly Black people who have vitamin D deficiency and don't know about it. And the other point I explore in my paper is that in our society, there should be much more research about the impact of vitamin D levels on people like us. Okay, and that, again, that's a structural problem. There are not enough people doing that kind of research because very few people are interested in it. And then if you do the research and you find out that you do need to, as a matter of routine, have more people getting vitamin D supplements, you put it in place. But that's a structural problem, yeah, rather than simply saying, oh yes, people are different because of their levels of vitamin D. It's one that lots of people jump on, and they provide lots of they use vitamin D because it's a way, as I said again, of adding some science to, if you like, racialized thoughts about how the qualities of people. But when you look at the science, it's not quite there. Also making my additional point, if you look at the ONS statistics, how they group people is quite weird. They group people according to, if you like, ethnic groups. So for example, they group Bangladeshis and Pakistanis, and they separate them from Indians, okay? And then they separate Africans. Sorry, they put all Africans in one group. So one of my arguments is that for these data to make more sense, you can't separate Indians and Pakistanis and then keep East Africans and West Africans in the same group. It makes no sense, okay? And when you look at the same data, the impact of COVID, for example, on these different groups, you find that, for example, Indians are far less affected than Pakistanis and Bangladeshis, yes? And genetically, there'd be much less difference between them. So how does one explain that, if you like, okay? So there are lots of issues around how the ONS has put together its data. That data is good if you're interpreting perhaps social things or things to do with ethnicity. But when you're trying to link those things with how a virus infects a population, it simply doesn't work. Another, I noticed because I did have a look at some of the comments on the article, and one individual in particular was going on about the ACE2 receptor. For if you don't know, the ACE2 receptor is the receptor which the virus binds and then gets into the cell. And some are arguing that the distribution of the ACE receptor may be linked again to different racial groups. And again, there is a genetic link to who has to the ACE receptor. There's definitely variants, but these variants have nothing. There's no evidence that show that it's to do with functionality. Because when you do a molecular type study, you can see, if you like, allelic variants between different populations. But that doesn't necessarily mean that those allelic variants are going to, if you like, transform into actual, if you like, actual functional differences. The other thing about that is, again, your level of ACE2 receptors is impacted on what kind of medication you have. So if you have high blood pressure and diabetes, and you are taking ACE inhibitors, you will have high levels of these receptors. And some people are saying that's the reason why BME people with high blood pressure and diabetes and cardiovascular diseases. And there is some truth in that. But then I go back to my original point about structural racism. One of the reasons BME people tend to have high blood pressure and diabetes and all those kind of conditions, again, is because of structural racism. They are inherent in those groups. It's just the environmental conditions have, if you like, brought those to the fore. So it's very important that we think about those. According to the scientists, it came from bats. That's the natural host. And then it's transferred to us via a third species, and they think perhaps a pangolin or something like that. Okay, so so what we're seeing is a virus that is going from species to species to species, mammalian species, and also I don't know if you heard the stories about it infecting. I think is it tiger and lions in a zoo. Okay, so anyway, it's transferred to other mammals. So what we have is if you like, a virus that's not very discriminating. Okay, it will infect lots of mammalian species, and yet at the same time, we're arguing that it's suddenly going to distinguish between someone who's of Pakistani origin and someone who's of Indian origin. Okay, it does make. How would it be? How is it going to be able to make that kind of distinguishing um, effect? Yet it can't distinguish between, if you like, a bat and a tiger and a human. It will infect all of them. So, but when you look at the other information, it all comes down, as I said, to these structural issues within our society, and that's what people are not talking about because they're being, if you like, um, being confused by the science, or being deliberately, if you like, misled by some of the science.
And also in the Caribbean,
Mm.
there seems to be I guess the different countries and their authorities seem to have quite a good grasp on keeping the numbers of deaths quite low across the region.
Mm-hmm.
I wondered if
Right.
the points that you raised just now feed into, I guess, why we're seeing lower numbers there.
Well, I presume if you're going to be infected by a virus, the virus needs to get there. And one of the things that a lot of the Caribbean countries were very good at is they shut down pretty quickly, and they were able to isolate those people who had the virus very quickly. So that's the main reason. So again, if all these myths about black people being infected, even with those small numbers who did make it to the Caribbean, you know, it would be going wild, if you like, and you know, it'd be sort of everyone would be dropping. But that hasn't happened. So it's about did the virus get there, and how you respond to it in terms of social distancing. In terms of the inquiry, well, I mean, well, first of all, one of the key things I've been trying to, in my small way, trying to influence what they do think and talk about, and is basically how the ONS puts together its statistics, especially in terms of this type of report, and then they report it, because in that way you can get a clearer picture. At the moment, it's a really confusing picture. And it doesn't help. It doesn't help when people are trying to explain things, because sometimes they're grouping, for example, people are just BME versus white. Next time they might be doing a more deeper analysis. But as I said, it's still not categorizing people in the right way. If you're talking about something that's more biological, if the inquiry comes and said race, there's absolutely nothing to do with race. It's all to do with, if you like, how society is organized. That would make me happy. But a lot of black people were feeling almost on the siege when they were seeing all these statistics, and because it was just looking as if it's down to them. And again, I wrote this to say, you know, is it really down to you? You know, that's why I asked the question: is it because I'm black? And I just want to say, perhaps no, it's not because you're black. I would sort of like change that ending when I ask the question again: is it because I'm black? And I'd say, no, it isn't because you're black, but it's because you're racialized as black. It's this idea of racialization. That's the issue.